listening.
I'm going to start, so I have a story, and I hope to get through it, maybe not. It's going to appear in a collection that's coming out next year from Small Beer Press called The Natural History of Hell is the collection. This story is called The Blameless. They were sitting at their respective ends of the couch drinking coffee. He was telling her about a cucumber salad he'd made a few days earlier, and she was going through the day's mail, half listening. In the midst of him reeling off his newly invented recipe, she held up a square envelope and set her coffee down on the table next to her. "A wedding invitation," she said, cutting him off. "Who's it from?" he asked. "The people up the street." "Which ones?" "The Crorys." "I have no idea," he said. "3 doors down and on the other side. Remember, we met them at Canoe Carnival. Ina's a secretary at the high school, and he's some kind of engineer." She opened the envelope and took out a card. "Who's getting married?" "It's for their daughter, Grace." "She's not even out of high school, I don't think." "It's not a wedding, it's an invitation to her exorcism." He laughed. "Get out of here." "Dear Tom and Helen, we hope that you will be able to attend our daughter Grace's spring exorcism. It's at their house on Sunday, May 7th at 7 p.m., 2 weeks from tomorrow." "What?" "This is big now, exorcism," she said. "Haven't you heard about it?" "No." "Yeah, people are getting their kids exercised for whatever ails them." "What do you mean?" he said. "You know, if your kid doesn't listen, is screwing up in school, hanging with knuckleheads." "You mean sex, drugs, and rock and roll, basically." "I heard it on NPR. A few evangelical groups started, and then it spread. Now people who aren't even religious are getting it done. It costs like $1,000 to have your kids spring cleaned. That's crazy. Which is why we should go. I want to check it out," she said. "Are you serious? It'll be interesting and we can meet people." "I have zero interest." "You're going," she said. "You were just sitting here 5 minutes ago carrying on about some fucking cucumber salad. You need to get out of the house." At 6:30 on May 7th, she put on a turquoise dress, matching shoes and jewelry. She told Tom that she tried to pick a spring color. He dressed in a black t-shirt and jeans, and she said, "It's not a funeral, you know." He said, "Well, we'll represent cosmic light and darkness." She shook her head, sighed, and left the room. He changed his shirt. It was raining, so they took the umbrella. Helen held it over both of them. As they made their way up the street, she pointed out through the dust that the daffodils and lilacs were budding. Tom noticed that the lawns were going green. There was a softness in the breeze. The street light reflected a sheen off the wet asphalt, and the scent of worms was everywhere. There were cars parked in front of the Crorys' house on both sides of the street. As they approached, they saw a man and a woman on the doorstep. He was ringing the bell. "That's Jake and Alice," said Helen. "It's not too late to go home," Tom said. "Go ahead," she told him. "I'll go by myself. Say the devil shows up." "The invitation says there'll be punch and finger sandwiches," she said. "I hope they appreciate that I wore my pink button shirt." "How could they not?" she told him. A middle-aged blonde woman answered the door. "So glad you could make it," she said in a high-pitched voice laced with gin. Her dress was the same color pink as Tom's shirt. "Hi, Ina," said Ellen. "You must be pretty excited." "Well," she said, "yes, but we need to keep a lid on it, you know, to retain the religious dignity of things." "Absolutely," said Tom. When they entered the living room, everyone turned and stared. After eyeing Tom and Helen up and down, a few neighbors nodded and waved and turned back to their conversations. Helen's friend Alice, who was also a nursing administrator, came over and said hello. They worked at different local hospitals, but they knew all the same people. In an instant, they were off on a conversation about work. Tom spotted a guy holding a beer and went in search of. In the kitchen, he found a cooler and his ex-assistant soccer coach, Bill Stewart. The two had bonded years earlier through losing seasons over the fact that neither of them had ever played or knew anything about soccer. Tom chose a can of Rolling Rock from the cooler, opened it, and looked quickly over his shoulder to make sure they were alone. "Ready for the exorcism?" he asked. Bill leaned back against the sink, arms folded across his chest, beer in his right hand. "I could deal with religion, but this is like some kind of Children of the Corn shit," he said. Tom laughed. Bill took a drink of beer and said, "You know, with these people, everything's an infraction. If you sneeze and fart at the same time, you're cut out of the rapture." Tom milled around, had a few beers, and checked in with Helen, who was talking baseball with O'Shea, the owner of the service station. Nothing seemed pressing, so he sat down in a chair at the end of the food table and watched the goings-on. Right next to him, he was surprised to find a bowl of cucumber salad. He had a small plate, better than mine, he thought. While he ate, snatches of conversation popped out of the surrounding storm of voices. From one of them, he learned that when the cashier at the pizza place had her kid exercised, there was shotgun vomiting and bed shaking to beat the band. From another, he overheard that there was now a 24-hour exorcist service in the tri-state area. The devil's busy, thought Tom, and then Grace made her entrance. She was wearing what looked like a young girl's communion dress, all white, sleeveless, satin, and crinoline, with a pair of white patent leather shoes. Her brown hair was twisted into an intricate single braid down her back, and on top of her head rested a wreath of tiny white and violet flowers. How different she looked to Tom compared to the last he'd seen her. He'd been driving by the recycle center downtown around Christmas time and noticed a tall, lanky kid jumping up and down and flapping his arms. He realized it was the Zek's son from around the corner. Morrison was his name. As Tom passed, he saw the reason for the goofball antics. The Crory girl was sitting on a low wall, rocking back and forth, laughing. She had a cigarette going, her hair hung loose, her eyeliner and mascara were copious and black. Tom remembered that the sight of them had made him smile. Unlike that winter day, she now seemed embarrassed, and her face was scrubbed clean and shone like a polished apple. He hardly recognized her. She was pretending to be calm like a bride on her wedding day. In less than a second, a crowd drew around her. Tom heard Helen whispering in his ear, "Slow down on the beer." He turned and she was standing next to his chair. "I'm just trying to retain the religious dignity of things," he told her. "Grace looks beautiful, doesn't she?" she said. "Almost as lovely as you, my dear." She lightly smacked him in the back of the head. He pointed to the cucumber salad and they laughed. "You know," Tom said, "I see people giving her cards. Do they actually have like cards for this now? I have one in my purse for her. What's it say? 'Congratulations on your exorcism.' I didn't go for the funny ones. It's very tasteful." How much are we giving her?" "50. Gee, she'll clean up." Helen went and got the card, and Tom stood. They slowly made their way toward the crowd of well-wishers. Before they could get anywhere close to Grace, though, Mr. Crory appeared. It was the first they'd seen of him. He stood stiff and smiling, dressed in a powder blue pajama suit with a bow tie. "Escaped from Hugh Hefner's closet," Helen said from the corner of her mouth. "Dig the smoke-tinted circular lenses," said Tom. There were visible beads of sweat on Crory's forehead. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and neighbors, the exorcist will be here any second. I ask that when he arrives, you all back off to that side of the room in front of the window. You must remain as quiet as possible throughout the exorcism. If you need to leave, please use the back door, which is through the kitchen. Ina and Grace and I want to thank you for joining us." Everybody applauded. When he was finished, he went down the hallway and returned with a cot, which he set up in front of the fireplace. The final touch was a puffy pillow the size of a cloud in a cream-colored pillowcase. There was a loud knock at the door. Ina said, "It's him," and finished off the remainder of a martini. A rumble went through those assembled. Some smiled vaguely, and the rest wore expressions of guilt. "I wonder if I can take pictures," said Helen, holding up her phone. "Just leave the flash off. Who'll know?" he said. Ina led the exorcist into the living room. He was short, heavy-set guy in a baggy black suit, dark beard and hair going gray. Mr. Crory shook hands with him, and Ina gave him a hug and a kiss on the cheek. She then turned to the neighbors and said, "This is the Reverend Emmanuel Cann. He's the High Holy Blameless from the local chapter of God's Church before the flood of mankind." During the crowd's applause, Helen whispered, "Check those brows." Tom did, and it was as if the Reverend had half a handlebar mustache over each eye. The Crorys backed away to join the crowd, and it was just Grace and Emmanuel Cann. That name made Tom giddy and brought him to the very edge of laughing out loud. The Reverend set his black bag down on the floor and took the girl's extended fingers in his hands. He looked into her eyes and said, "Are you ready now?" In a regional dialect, neither south nor north. She put on a very slight smile, and a tear ran down her cheek. "Aw," said the voices in the crowd. They were promptly shushed by Mr. Crory. Grace nodded to the Reverend, and he released her hands. "I'm going to remove some evil spirits from you today, employing serenity, the language in which angels dream, and then I'll bring to bear the righteous weapons of the Almighty, who has whispered to me through my eyes the number 4. And so I will take a demon from your left eye, one from your right ear, one from your mouth, and then one from lower down. The last will be the most difficult, but you'll get through it. You're young and strong." Grace smiled and nodded, and then he took her fingertips again and led her to the cot. "Starting to get creepy," said Helen. Out of his black bag, the Blameless One took a plastic bottle of water, a cigarette lighter, a pack of Marlboro, and an 8-inch hat pin. He set these items down on the seat of an empty chair and then turned back to the cot. "Comfortable?" he asked Grace. She nodded. "You will soon be in a trance," he said. Don't try to listen to what I'm saying. Instead, think of the sound of my voice as water flowing upward into the land without worry. He turned to face the gathering, opened his mouth, and out came a string of gibberish, startling in its speed. More followed like blasts from an Uzi. Tom heard somebody behind him ask quietly, "Is that Latin?" He knew enough Latin to know it was instead some just nonsense, like bad scat singing. Phrases like dippy-doop and fa-fa-fa-fa-fa-fa-fa were a giveaway. The Reverend trod in tight circles, always turning his head so as to keep his imperious gaze trained on the crowd. Just when Tom was ready to slip out into the kitchen for a beer, Khan suddenly broke from his little circle with a move that became a slow, loopy dance. He was all over the place, back and forth, side to side, movement minus style and rhythm. At one point, he bent his forearms in toward his chest and waved his elbows like a chicken. Through all of it, the gibberish poured forth. "Ridiculous," said Helen. "I've had enough, but you got to get a shot of this guy before we go," said Tom. "I've got like a dozen of them already. All right, let's blow." "Okay," Helen said, but Grace opened her mouth and groaned in an echoing underground voice that was chilling. Tom moved closer to Helen, took her hand. The place was dead quiet. Even the Reverend went silent. Another groan came. Her entire body was trembling, and one steel leg of the cot tapped a code on the hardwood floor. Emmanuel Cannon lit a cigarette, picked up the hat pin, and addressed the crowd. "Watch closely," he said. "I'm now going to evict from Grace's left eye a demon known as Skitterby, Prince of Illicit Visions. This should go quickly now." He took a drag of the cigarette and held the cigarette in the corner of his mouth while walking backward toward the cot. He turned, leaned over the girl, and blew a stream of smoke into her face. Quick as a snake, his free hand shot out and appeared he was pinching Grace's vacant left eye. As he slowly withdrew his pincered fingers, Tom and Helen and the rest noticed a bright blue blob, an amoebic form the size of a plum, with wriggling almost limbs and a pointy head trapped between the nails of his index and finger and thumb. The Blameless let it squirm for a moment before stabbing it with the hat pin. The instant it was impaled, it shattered like a blue glass bubble. "That was a trick, right?" said Tom. "I think he's like a magician," said Helen. "Looked pretty real for whatever it was." A few people applauded, and Mr. Crory angrily shushed them. Emmanuel Khan removed the cigarette from his lips and took a slight bow. "That was easy enough," he said. "Next I will extract the mouth demon, Verbopolis, and the ear demon, Waxeon. In one swift eviction, I will take them both out through the mouth. Not too many exorcists can perform this double demon pull. Look for a red figure and a green figure." He put the cigarette back in his mouth and took a deep drag. As he approached Grace, she gave a pitiful groan and belched. He swept low and blew smoke down her throat. His arms shot out and those pinching fingers entered her open mouth. His wrist twitched once and he withdrew two more writhing blobs. Their colors were brilliant. The red one growled and the green wore a jellified smile. "Verbopolis and Waxeon, ladies and gentlemen," said the Reverend. He jabbed the needle through both at once and they burst into Christmas glitter. "We will now have a 15-minute intermission before we descend into the lair of Moxiotin." Everyone in the living room headed for the kitchen. Ina was already there, dashing off a martini. Tom and Helen got beers and then stepped outside on the patio where there was an awning and two chairs. The light rain tapped above them. "Psyched for the lair of Moxiotin," said Tom. "The whole thing's disturbing. You want to split?" Helen took a drink and shook her head. "No, I'm going to go back in there and watch, and if something crosses the line, I'm going to call the cops." "What line?" "My line," she said. "How's he doing those little creatures?" "I don't know, instantly inflating balloons." "Is that a real thing, instantly inflating balloons?" he said. "I don't know," said Helen. "I'm a product of the age of reason, though," she said. "I'm with you. All I know is we're getting old and the world is weird," said Helen. "Fucked up," said Tom and put his arm around her. Tom and Helen maneuvered their way back through the crowded kitchen. Words of bewilderment and awe were in the air. Ina was dashing off another martini. Jake was darting his pinched fingers at Alice's mouth. She was giving him a look of disgust. In the shadowy corner of the dining room, Bill Stewart was asleep in a chair, his arms folded across his chest. They made it back to the living room and took a spot a little closer to the fireplace. Grace was still intermittently groaning, her stare still blank. The crowd soon came in from the kitchen. Crory lectured about silence and the room quieted down. Everybody heard a toilet flush and after the footsteps of the Blameless approaching from the hall. His first order of business was to check on Grace's condition. He spoke his gibberish to her for a few seconds and she panted. "She needs to get heated up," the Reverend said over his shoulder to the crowd. He danced erratic for a few steps, stopped only a few feet from Tom and Helen and spoke Moxiotin, the Grani Champio of negative entities, he said. This spirit of destruction, spirit of grief, is an aggregate of Grace's sins, both real and imagined by herself and others. A powerful demon that once removed will leave her feeling 5 pounds lighter. My mind's reeling with scenarios of what's about to happen, none of them good, said Tom, leaning down over Helen. He looked up and saw Crowry glaring at him. Tom gave him a wave and put his finger to his lips. Crowry shook his head in disappointment. Ellen caught sight of the exchange and said, "What a Nazi." Meanwhile, the Reverend again took to dancing and spitting out gibberish. Grace suddenly shrieked and the crowd jumped and murmured. She shuddered and the cot banged against the floor. Okay, said Immanuel Khan and stood still, breathing heavily from the exertion of his pathetic waltz. What's about to happen is somewhat dangerous, so please, remain calm and still. The creature I'm about to expose is frightening, but do not cry out or he could possibly be drawn to you. He walked over to his black bag, leaned down, and retrieved a gleaming 9mm pistol from it. I found a hat pin. The hat pin doesn't quite do it. Whoa, somebody said in the crowd, and a half-dozen people headed for the back door. Yes, that's it, said the Reverend. Let those without faith in the Almighty flee his judgment. Tom looked down at Helen. She looked up at him. Without speaking, they decided to stay. Con stood and walked in front of Grace, facing the crowd. She was having a pitiful time of it, bouncing against the cot, crying out, The demon knows I'm coming for him, and now I will invite the young woman's father to join me and read off a list of her sins. And the mother will step forward and remove an article of her clothing so that I might proceed. He waved the parents out of the crowd with the muzzle of the gun and then put the weapon on the chair with his other tools. Corey and Ina stepped forward. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and brought out a pink 3x5 index card. She had tears streaming down her face, smearing her makeup, and held onto his right arm with a trembling hand. She wove to and fro, obviously drunk. Her husband adjusted his glasses, cocked his big head forward, and read in a strained voice, Our daughter Grace has lost her way, fallen into temptation under the influence of evil. Here are the sins we are conscious of. 1, pleasuring herself. 2, partaking of the pernicious weed. 3, drinking alcohol. 4, consorting with atheists. 5, she is 10 pounds overweight. 6, painting her face and wearing suggestive clothing. When he was finished, he assumed a solemn air, folded the paper twice, returned it to his pocket. With the exception of the last one, Tom whispered, that's like a normal day for me. Helen stuck her index finger into his belly. Try 20 pounds overweight, she said. I just want my baby back, cried Ina. She looked wrung out, ready to drop over. Poor thing, said Helen. Crowry returned to his spot in the crowd. The Reverend ushered Ina to the cot. He leaned over the writhing girl, put his open palms less than an inch from her forehead, and moved them slowly around like he was polishing a car. He continued with this motion down the length of her body, very nearly but not touching her throat, her breasts, her stomach. He spent a long time conjuring above her crotch, and then swept the rest of the way to her feet. Ina stepped over then and removed Grace's right shoe. In the act of pulling it off, she staggered, and the Reverend caught her. He motioned to Crowry and said, please take care of this. Crowry emerged from the crowd to lead his wife away. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, the big toe, said the blameless, the seat of Moxiotin's rule. You can't walk straight without a big toe, and the Almighty wants this young woman to walk straight. He went quickly to the chair, took up his cigarettes and lit one, keeping it in the corner of his mouth. He threw the pack down and grabbed the gun, holding it at the ready in his right hand. Back at the cot, he blew smoke rings onto Grace's big toe. He wiggled his fingers of his left hand all around Moxiotin's lair. Stand back now, he yelled. The girl was fish-flopping on the cot, sweating, groaning, shrieking, letting off snatches of her own gibberish. The Reverend's pinching fingers shot out and pincered something just beneath the curve of the toenail. He planted his feet and pulled back, and his pose made it obvious there was a struggle going on. Slowly he extracted what looked like a khaki-colored blob. He backed up and drew it out a little further. It was immensely bigger than all the other demons put together, and it kept emerging from her toe. As it grew, it took on the features of a face, and it became clear he had it by its pointy nose. Its mouth opened to show sharp teeth, and it growled and barked. One of its big yellow eyes stared hard at the exorcist, and the other scanned the crowd. A string of curse words came from Khan, followed by a loud, "Get the fuck out here." There was a snapping noise, and it retracted back into her toe. A wave of gasps erupted from the crowd. "What the F," said Tom. Satan's bubble gum, said Helen. The Reverend wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and then his fingers dove in for a second try. He caught hold of it, pinched hard, pulled Moxiotin. He caught hold of it, pinched hard, and pulled. Moxiotin appeared again, growing like an angry tan thought. Khan lifted the gun, stuck it into the side of the demon, and pulled the trigger twice. The crowd ducked at the report of the 9mm. The demon seemed insubstantial enough for the bullets to pass through easily, but they didn't. The gun smoke misted the weird tableau. Grace, the Reverend, and Moxiotin reached a fever-pitch chorus of agonizing grunts and squeals. I've got to pull it free from her to destroy it, yelled the exorcist. The struggle continued. People fled for the back door. Then that sharp-toothed maw opened wide, and a burst of fire shot out as if it were a flamethrower. The Reverend's baggy black suit, beard, and eyebrows were instantly aflame. He stumbled backward, firing off shots into the ceiling. His arms waved up and down, but this time he wasn't dancing. He lurched forward. He lurched toward what was left of the crowd. Helen grabbed Tom by the arm and pulled him out of the way. Emmanuel Khan, all smoldering hair and stink of singed meat, swept past him into the drapes of the living room's front window. The gun went off and a shot out one of the panes as he fell to the floor. Fire swept up the fabric and leaped onto the couch. The place was in an uproar. Tom and Helen made for the back door through the smoke and commotion. He looked over his shoulder and saw three things happen almost simultaneously. Somehow Crory had come up with a fire extinguisher, was dousing the blameless, the drapes and furniture. Ina had made it to the cot and was helping Grace up. The last was the most spectacular. Morrison Zek, that lanky kid who'd not shown himself all night, appeared. He pushed Ina onto the floor and helped the bleary Grace stand by putting her arm over his shoulder. The two of them headed for the front door. That was the last Tom saw before he and Helen passed into the dining room and on to the kitchen. Outside it was still drizzling. They ran into Bill Stewart, standing amid a clutch of neighbors on the front lawn. Did you see it, he asked Tom. I thought you were asleep in the dining room. No, I woke up when the second act got underway. I caught most of it, but once he started shooting, I took off. Remind me never to doubt the existence of demons again, said Tom. Unbelievable, said Bill. I don't buy it, said Helen. Well, you may not, but Emmanuel Khan did, said Tom. 20 minutes passed, and yet the neighbors remained on the front lawn in the fine drizzle, waiting for a sign that all was well. Eventually the front door opened, and the Reverend appeared in the porch light and somewhat blackened and frayed, but on his feet. He carried his black bag in one hand and his pistol in the other. Crory and Ina appeared behind him in the doorway. Khan turned and yelled back at them, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." As he passed toward the road in his car, he glowered at the crowd. "Ignorant sinners," he shouted. "If that's an act," said Bill, "he should be on America's Got Talent." "He's a menace," said Helen. Tom looked to the house and saw Ina weaving across the lawn toward the neighbors. He barely heard her voice as she thanked Jake and Alice and O'Shea, the others. Behind her, Mr. Crory sat on the porch, his powder blue jacket and bow tie gone, his face in his hands, elbows resting on his knees. It looked like he was sobbing. "Check it out," Tom said to Helen and nudged her. She turned and looked. "What a mess," she said. "I've been exactly there more than once," said Tom. Ina staggered over to them in her rounds. "I'm so sorry about tonight," she said. "Please forgive us. The last thing we wanted was to put you in harm's way." The exorcist came highly recommended. "Recommended by who?" asked Bill. "He had four 5-star reviews out of 6 on Yahoo," she said. "No sweat," said Tom. Ina said to Helen, "Can I talk to you for a second?" and took her wrist. They moved away from Tom and Bill. 15 minutes later, Tom and Helen were in their CRV, moving slowly along the twisting suburban night streets. Helen drove, Tom squinted and scanned the hedge-lined properties, the oak thickets and trim lawns. "Why didn't they just call the cops?" Tom asked. "You know what that's like from our own kids." "Yeah, I remember. They can't have gone far on foot. That Zek kid rescuing Grace reminded me of the end of The Graduate," he said. "Well, she's got to get home now. Ina's distraught." Even the weird old man looked on the verge. "What are you doing on your phone? You're supposed to be keeping an eye out." "How are we going to miss her? She's dressed like the fucking Snow Queen. I'm looking up if there's such a thing as self-inflating balloons." "I'm telling you, it was all a trick gone wrong," she said. "Here it is. There is such a thing as self-inflating balloons, but they don't look anything like that stuff the Blameless was pulling out of Grace. That shit seemed alive." "Remember Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs," she said. "Did they look real?" "Yeah." Case closed. "Why don't you check by the lake?" "Oh, you ready? Done?" I He's got 4 minutes on here. It's 5:56.
Keep going. 25 minutes and 5 minutes refresh. But, you know, he's good on 30 seconds to a minute. Don't get what's going to.
I got a page.
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you check over by the lake? That's where our guys always went to get in trouble. They drove slowly in silence till they arrived at the dirt parking lot near the playground at Holloway Lake. The rain had stopped and the moon played peekaboo from behind the clouds. Helen put the car in park and reached to turn the lights off. She didn't, though. You see out to the left near the shore, over by where the cattails start? I think there's somebody sitting on that bench. He squinted. I can't see shit. Come on, we'll go check it out, she said, and killed the headlights. What if it's Moxie Otten? She opened the door and got out. He followed her. They walked across the sand beyond the swing set. The lake smelled of spring and stirred in the breeze. Tell me honestly, he said, when the Blameless first spoke of Moxie Otten, did you ever think he was going to pull that demon from her big toe? That one will come from lower down, she said in the Reverend's voice, and laughed. If you're right and it's an act, it's genius. The gun was a surprise, she said. Next time we get an invitation to one of these, say no. Helen raised her arm and motioned for him to be quiet. They were getting closer to the bench. Walk soft, she whispered. They drew within 20 feet, and the moon came through the clouds. The girl's dress shone like a beacon in the sudden light. Grace and Morrison Zeck slumped shoulder to shoulder, both asleep. Tom and Helen quietly moved a few feet closer. She took his wrist when she wanted him to stop. They stood in silence for a moment. Tom leaned down and whispered in her ear, that Zeck kid's a goofball. Helen shook her head. Do I call Ina? He asked, taking out his cell phone. It took her a while to answer. No, she said, I don't think so. Why not? They're you too young to be friends. They must just be lovers. When the moon went away, they walked back to the CRV and drove home. Later, the rain started in again. The sound and smell of spring came through the screen of their bedroom window, while he dreamt in the language the angels dream in, and she of the land without worry.